What if I told you that the most powerful words ever written about joy came from a man sitting in chains, waiting to die? Picture this: a cold, dark Roman prison cell somewhere around 62 AD. The Apostle Paul, once a feared persecutor of Christians, now sits as Apostle Paul, prisoner himself. His wrists are raw from metal shackles. Rats scurry across the stone floor. Outside, Roman guards debate whether he'll face execution tomorrow or next week. Yet, in this place of absolute despair, Paul picks up his pen and writes what scholars call the most joyful letter in the Bible. How is that even possible? Here's what's shocking. In Philippians 4, Paul reveals a secret so powerful that it has transformed millions of lives across 2,000 years. He's not writing theory from a comfortable study. He's teaching from the laboratory of suffering, and what he discovered changes everything. This isn't just ancient history. What Paul learned in that prison cell is the exact answer to the anxiety, stress, and chaos crushing people today. In the next few minutes, you'll discover why Philippians 4 might be the most practical, powerful chapter you've ever encountered. Because if it worked in a Roman dungeon, imagine what it can do in your life. Paul sat in a Roman prison cell, chains wrapped around his wrists. The metal was cold against his skin. He didn't know if tomorrow would bring his execution or another day of waiting. The walls around him were stone, thick and damp. Light barely filtered through the small opening above. This was where the Roman Empire put people they wanted to forget. But something remarkable was happening in that cell. Paul wasn't writing a letter of complaint. He wasn't begging for rescue. Instead, he was putting words on paper that would change the world. His chains clinked as he wrote to his friends in Philippi, a church he had started years before. They were worried about him. They had heard he was imprisoned, and they wanted to help. The irony was impossible to miss. Here was a man who had lost his freedom, teaching others about joy. He couldn't walk out of that cell. He couldn't choose what he ate or when he slept. Roman guards decided everything for him. Yet from this place of complete powerlessness, Paul was writing the most joyful letter in the entire Bible. This wasn't some comfortable teacher sitting in a library writing theories about how to be happy. Paul was living it. The word he wrote came from real experience. The cold he felt, the uncertainty he faced, the possibility of death hanging over him. All of it was real. And still, he wrote about joy. The church in Philippi needed to hear from him. Notice what he did there. He didn't just say it once. He said it, then stopped, then said it again. It was like he was making sure they couldn't miss it. Rejoice always. Not sometimes. Not when things are going well. Always. This wasn't a suggestion. Paul was giving a command. When someone repeats something immediately after saying it, they're trying to make absolutely sure you understand. It's the same way you might tell a child something important twice to make sure it sinks in. Paul knew this truth was so vital, so life-changing, that he couldn't risk anyone skipping over it. But here's what made this command different from everything else the world taught. Paul said, "Rejoice in the Lord always." He didn't say, "Rejoice in your circumstances." He didn't say, "Rejoice because everything is perfect." He said, "Rejoice in the Lord." That little phrase changed everything. Joy, the way. Paul understood it wasn't connected to what was happening around him. It was connected to who was with him, the Lord, Jesus. That connection didn't change when circumstances changed. Whether Paul was free or chained, fed or hungry, praised or beaten, the Lord was still there. That was the source of joy. Most people think joy is what you feel when good things happen. Paul was teaching something completely different. He was saying, joy is who you know, not what you have. It's a relationship, not a feeling that comes and goes with your luck. The urgency in his repetition showed how desperately he wanted them to understand. This wasn't minor advice. This was the key to surviving everything they were about to face. Rejoice in the Brayton. Lord always. When persecution comes, rejoice in the Lord. When friends betray you, rejoice in the Lord. When nothing makes sense, rejoice in the Lord. Right after commanding joy, Paul said something in verse 5 that seemed to change direction completely. Let your gentleness be evident to all. But this wasn't a random thought. It was directly connected to everything he had just said about joy. In the Roman world, gentleness was seen as weakness. Rome had conquered the known world through force. Their soldiers were trained to be brutal. Their empire was built on the crom and stay idea that might makes right. If you were gentle, you were a victim waiting to happen. Paul flipped that thinking upside down. He said, "Let your gentleness be obvious. Don't hide it. Don't apologize for it. Let everyone see it. In a world of fists and swords, be gentle." This wasn't weakness. This was power under control. Think about it. When you're truly confident, you don't need to prove anything. You don't need to dominate others or force your way. You can be gentle because you know who's in control, and it's not you, it's God. Gentleness becomes a kind of witness. When people see someone who could respond with anger but chooses gentleness instead, they notice. When they see someone who could fight back but doesn't, questions start forming in their minds. What makes this person different? Where does this strength come from? Paul wanted the believers in Philippi to understand that their gentleness would speak louder than any argument. In a harsh world, kindness stands out. In a violent culture, peace catches attention. The Roman guards, watching Paul, probably saw this in him. Here was a prisoner who didn't curse them, didn't plot revenge, didn't grow bitter. That kind of response didn't make sense unless something supernatural was happening. This gentleness wasn't fake. It wasn't pretending everything was fine. It was the natural result. The joy Paul had just talked about. When you're rejoicing in the Lord, when your security comes from Him and not from controlling your circumstances, you can afford to be gentle. You don't need to protect yourself through force because you have a protector. Then Paul added something that explained why gentleness was possible. At the end of verse 5, he wrote, "The Lord is near." 3 simple words that carried enormous meaning. The Lord is near, not far away, not distant, and uncaring. Near. Close enough to touch, close enough to hear a whisper, close enough to see every tear and know every fear. This statement worked on 2 levels, and Paul probably meant both. Notice what he did there. He didn't just say it once. He said it, then stopped, then said it again. It was like he was making sure they couldn't miss it. Rejoice always. Not sometimes. Not when things are going well. Always. This wasn't a suggestion. Paul was giving a command. When someone repeats something immediately after saying it, they're trying to make absolutely sure you understand. It's the same way you might tell a child something important twice to make sure it sinks in. First, the Lord was near in presence. Jesus wasn't in heaven ignoring what was happening on earth. He was right there with Paul in that prison cell. He was right there with the Philippians as they faced their struggles. His presence was a reality they could count on. Second, the Lord was near in time. Jesus was coming back. The return of Christ wasn't some distant event, thousands of years away. It was near. It could happen at any moment. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses its power over you. Paul was writing from experience again. In that prison cell, he wasn't alone. Jesus was there. When the guards changed shifts, Jesus remained. When night fell and darkness filled the cell, Jesus was still present. The nearness of the Lord wasn't a nice idea. It was Paul's daily reality. For the Philippians facing persecution, this truth was like oxygen. This wasn't meant to scare them, but to encourage them. Whatever they were going through wouldn't last forever because the Lord's return was approaching. Knowing God is near changes everything about how you face problems. It's the difference between fighting a battle alone and fighting with the strongest ally possible, standing right beside you. When you're about to face something terrifying and someone you trust completely says, "I'm right here, with you." Brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Before diving into what each of those words meant, Paul was making a fundamental point. Your thought, life matters. Not just your actions, not just your words, your thoughts. What happens inside your head when no one else can see? Paul understood something that many people miss. Instead of worry themselves, he was teaching them how to hand it over to someone else. This command not to be anxious wasn't meant to shame people who struggle with fear. Paul knew anxiety well. He had faced shipwrecks, beatings, hunger, and constant danger. He understood what it felt like to lie awake, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He wasn't speaking from ignorance. What he was saying was that there's an alternative to living under the weight of anxiety. There's a way to take the heavy burdens crushing your chest and move them somewhere else. The command not to be anxious was only half the sentence. He was about to explain what to do instead. See, Paul wasn't just telling people to stop worrying without giving them a replacement. That would be cruel, useless. Anyone who has dealt with anxiety knows you can't just turn it off like a light switch. You need somewhere to put it. You need a process. The word in this verse is anything. Paul was being comprehensive on purpose. He didn't say, don't be anxious about small things or don't worry about things you can't control. He said anything. That means the big fears and the little ones, the logical worries and the irrational ones, the fears about today and the fears about 10 years from now. All of it fits under anything. Paul immediately gave the alternative to anxiety. They might feel abandoned by society, rejected by family, hunted by authorities, but they weren't alone. The Lord was near, not watching from a distance, but present in their suffering, walking with them through every hard moment. With this foundation laid, joy, gentleness, and God's nearness, Paul moved to one of the most practical pieces of advice in all of Scripture. In verse 6, he wrote, do one of the most practical pieces of advice. Not be anxious about anything. Do not be anxious about anything. It's bringing your focus to God instead of spiraling in your own thoughts. Prayer acknowledges that you're not alone with your problems. Petition is more specific. It's the actual request. It's saying exactly what you need. Paul wasn't teaching people to pray vague general prayers. He was telling them to be specific, name the problem, describe the need, ask for particular help. God already knows what you need, but the act of naming it helps you release it. But here's where Paul added the element that transforms everything: thanksgiving. With thanksgiving, not after you get what you want, not if things work out. With thanksgiving, meaning at the same time as your request, thanksgiving changes the nature of prayer from begging to trusting. When you thank God while asking for help, you're remembering that He's already helped you before. You're acknowledging His character and His faithfulness. You're shifting from, I don't know if God will come through too. God has always come through, and He will again. This isn't fake positivity. This is memory. When you practice thanksgiving while you're afraid, you're forcing your mind to remember the times God showed up before. Every past deliverance becomes evidence for present faith. Every previous answer to prayer becomes a reason to believe He'll answer again. Paul said, in every previous situation, not just some situations, everyone, the situations that make sense to pray about, and the ones that seem too small to bother God with the crises and the inconveniences. Every situation is an opportunity to transfer anxiety into place-phrase prayer. The process is simple but profound. Anxiety rises. Instead of letting it grow, you turn it into words directed at God. You name the problem specifically. And while you're asking for help, you remember His faithfulness with thanksgiving. That's the transfer system. Paul described this peace as transcending all understanding. That's a fascinating phrase. It means this peace doesn't make logical sense. Your circumstances might not have changed at all. The problem you prayed about might still be there, but internally, something has shifted. The chaos has calmed. The panic has eased. You have peace, and you can't fully explain why. This is supernatural peace. It defies the natural order of things. Paul described this peace as transcending all understanding. That's a fascinating phrase. It means this peace doesn't make logical sense. Your circumstances might not have changed at all. The problem you prayed about might still be there, but internally, something has shifted. The chaos has calmed. The panic has eased. You have peace, and you can't fully explain why. This is supernatural peace. It defies the natural order of things. Normally, if nothing changes externally, nothing changes internally. But God's peace works differently. It can flood your heart even when everything around you remains broken. It can quiet your mind even when the situation still looks hopeless. People watching from the outside won't understand it. They'll see your circumstances and think you should be falling apart. They'll wonder how you're still functioning. They might even think you're in denial. But you're not. Brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Before diving into what each of those words meant, Paul was making a fundamental point. Your thought, life matters. Not just your actions, not just your words, your thoughts. What happens inside your head when no one else can see? Paul understood something that many people miss. You're shifting from, I don't know if God will come through too. God has always come through, and he will again. This isn't fake positivity. This is memory. When you practice thanksgiving while you're afraid, you're forcing your mind to remember the times God showed up before. Every past deliverance becomes evidence for present faith. Every previous answer to prayer becomes a reason to believe he'll answer again. Paul said, in every previous situation, not just some situations, everyone. A guard protects against attacks. A guard stands between the protected person and any threat. That's what God's peace does for your heart and mind. Your heart, the center of your emotions and will, gets protected. Your mind, where thoughts and fears form, gets protected. The peace of God stands watch over both, like a soldier standing at his post. This is active protection, not passive. It's not just that you feel peaceful. It's that peace is actively defending you against the attacks of worry, fear, and despair. When anxious thoughts try to break through, peace pushes them back. When fear tries to overwhelm your emotions, peace holds the line. Paul wrote in Christ Jesus at the end, because that's where this protection operates. You have to be connected to Jesus for his peace to guard you. It's not a technique you can use independently. It's a relationship. The peace comes from him and works in those who are joined to him. Think about how a God works. The prisoner Paul was chained to didn't guard Paul because Paul was special or good. The guard did his job because Rome commanded it. In the same way, God's peace guards you not because you've earned it, but because you belong to Christ. It's his assignment. His peace has orders to protect you, and it carries out those orders faithfully. The hearts and minds, Paul mentioned, are the two main battlegrounds where we lose our peace. The heart feels the emotional weight of problems. The mind spins with worst-case scenarios and endless what-ifs. Both need protection, and God's peace guards both. This completed Paul's teaching on the foundation of joy. He had shown them the source, rejoicing in the Lord always. He had shown them the evidence, gentleness that comes from confidence in God. Normally, if nothing changes externally, nothing changes internally. But God's peace works differently. It can flood your heart even when everything around you remains broken. It can quiet your mind even when the situation still looks hopeless. People watching from the outside won't understand it. They'll see your circumstances and think you should be falling apart. They'll wonder how you're still functioning. They might even think you're in denial. But you're not. He had shown them the reality. The Lord is near. He had given them the method, transferring anxiety through prayer with thanksgiving. And he had described the result, supernatural peace that guards their hearts and minds. Paul shifted his focus to something more internal, but just as powerful. In verse 8, he began with the word finally, and then wrote finally. Your mind is a battlefield. Every single day, thoughts come at you from every direction. Some thoughts are helpful, some are destructive, some are true, some are lies. And what you do with those thoughts determines the course of your life. Think of it like this. A thought enters your mind. It seems small, harmless, but if you let it stay there, if you think about it over and over, something happens. That thought starts to shape how you see things. It influences your decisions. Before long, that thought has become an action. You do something based on that thought. Do that action enough times and it becomes a habit. You don't even think about it anymore. It's automatic, and habits repeated over years form your character. They make you who you are. So that small thought that seemed harmless, it was actually a seed that grew into something much bigger. Paul knew this. He had seen it in his own life and in the lives of others. He had watched people destroyed by toxic thinking. He had seen believers fall away because they let the wrong thoughts take root. He had also seen people transformed by changing what they allowed into their minds. This is why he couldn't end his letter without addressing it. He had talked about joy, about prayer, about peace, but none of that would last if the Philippians didn't learn to guard their minds. Spiritual warfare doesn't always look like dramatic battles with obvious enemies. Most of the time, it looks like the quiet war that happens between your ears. Every believer faces this battle. You wake up in the morning and thoughts start flooding in. Worries about the day, memories from yesterday, plans for tomorrow, judgments about yourself, opinions about others. Some of these thoughts come from God, some come from your own nature. Some come from the enemy who wants to destroy you. Learning to recognize which is which and what to do with them. That's not optional if you want to survive spiritually. Paul's about to give them a filter system, a way to sort through the constant stream of thoughts and decide which ones deserve their attention and which ones need to be thrown out. Immediately, Paul listed 8 specific qualities that should characterize their thinking. He wasn't being random. Each word he chose served a purpose, catching a different kind of mental poison. Whatever is true came first. Truth had to be the foundation. If a thought wasn't true, nothing else mattered. Paul wanted them to ask, is this thought based on reality? Or is it based on lies, assumptions, or fears? So much of human suffering comes from believing things that simply aren't true. Someone thinks everyone hates them. Not true. Someone thinks they're worthless. Not true. Someone thinks God has abandoned them. Not true. The first filter removes deception. Whatever is noble came next. The word noble meant honorable, worthy of respect, dignified. It was the opposite of trashy, vulgar, or degrading. Paul was saying some thoughts might be technically true, but still not worth thinking about. Yes, terrible things happen in the world. Yes, people do disgusting things, but dwelling on the degrading and vulgar pulls your mind into a dark place. Noble thoughts elevate you. They remind you of what's honorable and good in humanity and in God's creation. Whatever is right added the moral dimension. Right meant just aligned with God's standards. A thought might be true and even noble, but is it right? Does it align with what God says is good? This filter removes thoughts that lead towards sin or away from God's character. It's not enough for something to be interesting or popular. It has to be right. Whatever is pure dealt with motives and morality at the deepest level. Pure meant unmixed, clean, free from contamination. This filter especially applied to sexual thoughts, but it went beyond that. Any thought tainted with selfish ambition, revenge, bitterness, or hatred failed the purity test. Paul wanted their minds to be clean, not corrupted by the pollution that surrounded them. These first 4 filters, true, noble, right, pure, formed the moral and spiritual foundation. They dealt with truth, honor, justice, and purity. But Paul wasn't done. He added 4 more filters that might seem less obviously spiritual, but were just as important. Whatever is lovely brought in beauty. The word meant pleasing, attractive, gracious. God created a beautiful world, and he wants his people to think about beautiful things. Not everything has to be heavy and serious. Some thoughts are worth having simply because they're lovely. The sunset you saw yesterday, the smile on a child's face, the sound of music that moved you. These thoughts feed your soul. Whatever is admirable added the social dimension. Admirable meant worthy of respect, reputable, the kind of thing that makes others think well of you. This isn't about pride or showing off. It's about recognizing that Christians are witnesses to the world. What you think about will eventually come out in how you talk and act. Thinking about admirable things makes you an admirable person. If anything is, excellent raised the standard even higher. Excellence meant superior, outstanding, the best quality. Paul was calling them to think about things that represent the highest standard, not mediocre, not good enough, excellent. This pushes against the laziness that accepts whatever comes along. It says, be selective. Choose the best or praiseworthy, completed the list. Praiseworthy meant worthy of approval, commendable. It pointed toward things that deserve recognition and honor. This connects back to Thanksgiving. When you think about praiseworthy things, you naturally move toward gratitude. You start noticing what's good instead of only seeing what's wrong. 8 filters, each one catching something different. Together, they created a complete system for protecting the mind. Paul's inclusion of whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, revealed something important about how God views the human experience. These 2 qualities stood out because they weren't purely moral or spiritual categories. They dealt with beauty and reputation. Lovely things are things that please you. They're attractive. They bring joy. Simply by being observed. This could be art, nature, music, or even a kind gesture. Paul was saying God cares about beauty. He's not only concerned with whether something is morally right, he also cares whether it's beautiful. This made sense when you thought about who God is. He created a world full of unnecessary beauty. He didn't have to make flowers in thousands of colors. He didn't have to make sunsets that take your breath away. He didn't have to give birds beautiful songs, but he did. Beauty reflects his nature. He is beautiful, and he loves beauty. When Paul told the Philippians to think about lovely things, he was telling them to notice and appreciate beauty. Don't just rush through life focused on problems and tasks. Stop and see the lovely things around you. Let your mind rest on them. This isn't shallow or frivolous. It's part of being human and reflecting God's image. The world Paul lived in was harsh. Rome was brutal. Persecution was real. It would have been easy for Christians to become grim and joyless, thinking only about survival and morality. Paul was saying, no, make room for beauty. Think about lovely things. Let them feed your soul. Admirable worked differently, but was equally important. Admirable meant having a good reputation, being respected. Paul wasn't promoting pride or image management. He was acknowledging a reality. Christians live in a watching world. People judge the gospel by how Christians behave. What you think about shapes how you act, and how you act affects what others think of Christ. When you fill your mind with admirable things, acts of courage, examples of integrity, stories of kindness, you're training yourself to become that kind of person. You start acting in ways that earn respect. Not for your own glory, but so that the gospel looks attractive to those who don't believe yet. These 2 qualities, lovely and admirable, elevated the entire discussion. Paul wasn't just giving a list of moral do's and don'ts. He was painting a picture of a rich, full, mental life. A life where you notice beauty, appreciate goodness, and carry yourself in a way that makes others curious about the God you serve. Together, these qualities built you up instead of tearing you down. So much of what people think about degrades them. Gossip tears down. Pornography degrades. Conspiracy theories poison. Constant focus on problems and failures crushes the spirit. Paul was offering an alternative. Fill your mind with things that inspire, that elevate, that make you better. Paul closed his list with 2 final qualities that reached even higher. He wrote, "If anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." These last 2 categories functioned as a kind of summary while also adding something new. Excellence meant the highest quality, the best example of something. It was aspirational. Paul wasn't just saying avoid the bad. He was saying reach for the best. Don't settle for mediocre thinking. Don't be satisfied with thoughts that are merely, okay, go for excellence. This applied to everything. If you're going to think about someone's character, think about the most excellent examples of character you know. If you're going to think about a problem, think about the most excellent solutions. If you're going to remember something from Scripture, reach for the passages that show God's character most clearly. Always aim up. Excellence calls you forward. It doesn't let you stay comfortable where you are. When you make a habit of thinking about excellent things, you start wanting to become excellent yourself. You stop accepting laziness in your own life. You start pushing toward the best version of yourself. Praiseworthy added the element of recognition. Something praiseworthy deserves to be acknowledged and honored. When you think about praiseworthy things, you're training yourself to notice good. This fights against the quote, natural human tendency to focus on the negative. Most people's minds automatically go to what's wrong. They notice the one thing that went badly and ignore the 10 things that went well. They remember criticism and forget compliments. They see problems everywhere and miss the good right in front of them. Thinking about praiseworthy things rewires this pattern. When you deliberately focus on what deserves praise, you start seeing more of it. You notice when someone does something kind. You recognize when God answers a prayer. You appreciate when circumstances work out. This doesn't mean ignoring real problems. It means giving proper weight to the good instead of letting the bad dominate your thoughts. Together, excellence and praise created an upward pull. They moved your thinking toward growth and gratitude instead of stagnation and complaint. Paul was showing them how to escape the mental trap of negativity that catches so many people. Think about how different life looks when you train your mind this way. Instead of waking up and immediately rehearsing everything you're worried about, you could wake up and think about something excellent you read yesterday. Instead of spending your commute angry about traffic, you could spend it thinking about something praiseworthy you witnessed. Instead of lying awake at night running through your failures, you could fall asleep thinking about the excellent character of God. The command, think about such things, wasn't passive. It required action. You had to direct your mind intentionally. Thoughts don't automatically go to excellent and praiseworthy things. Left alone, your mind will drift toward fear, anger, lust, or despair. You have to steer it. After giving them the filter for their thoughts, Paul moved to action. In verse 9, he wrote, "Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice." This was a bold statement. Paul was telling them to imitate him, not just to listen to his teaching, but to copy his life. He was offering himself as a living example of everything he had been teaching. Some people might think this sounds arrogant. Who tells others to copy them? But Paul wasn't being prideful. He was being practical. Christianity isn't just information. It's transformation. And transformation happens when you see someone living it out and you follow their example. Paul had lived with these Philippians. He had started their church. They had watched him preach, pray, handle conflict, face opposition, and love people who were hard to love. They knew his character. They had seen his faith tested. Now he was saying, "That life you saw me living, do that." Notice how comprehensive his statement was. Whatever you have learned, that covered his teaching, the doctrines he explained, the theology he taught. They needed to remember and apply those truths, or received that referred to traditions and practices he had passed down to them. The way they conducted worship, how they treated each other, the disciplines they practiced or heard from me that included the personal conversations, the advice he had given, the corrections he had made, all of it counted or seen in me. This was the most powerful part. Not just what he said, but what he did, how he lived, when no one important was watching, the consistency between his words and his actions. Paul was saying all of it. The teaching, the traditions, the conversations, the example should be put into practice, not just stored in their memories, not just discussed in their meetings, put into practice, done, lived, out. This is how Christianity spreads, not through perfect theological arguments alone, not through impressive buildings or programs, through people who live it and show others how it works. Paul had shown them, no, they needed to do it. Theory without practice is useless. You can know all the right answers, have perfect theology, and quote scripture by memory. But if you don't put it into practice, nothing changes. You remain the same person, always were, just with more knowledge. Paul knew this. He had spent years teaching these believers. But he also knew that if they didn't apply what they learned, his work would be wasted. So, he made it clear, put it into practice. Actually, do the things I taught you and showed you. Paul attached a promise to this command. Right after telling them to put his teaching into practice, he wrote in the same verse, "And the God of peace will be with you." The promise was conditional. Notice the word "and." It connected the action to the result. If you put these things into practice, then the God of peace will be with you. The promise depended on obedience. This didn't mean God abandons you when you fail. That's not what Paul was teaching. God's love isn't conditional. His saving grace isn't something you earn, but his felt presence, his active work in your daily experience that intensifies when you obey. Think of it like a relationship between a teacher and student. The teacher cares about all students, but which students experience more of the teacher's time and attention? The ones who show up, do the homework, ask questions, and apply what they're learning. The teacher's love doesn't change, but the depth of interaction does. Paul was saying, when you take what you've learned and actually do it, you experience more of God's presence. The God of peace doesn't just exist somewhere far away. He's with you. You feel him. You see his work in your life. Things happen that can only be explained by his active involvement. This makes sense when you think about it. God reveals himself to those who seek him. When you obey his teachings, when you put his principles into practice, you're seeking him. You're showing that you trust him enough to do things his way. And he responds to that trust by making his presence more evident in your life. The phrase God of peace was significant. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses its power over you. Paul was writing from experience again. In that prison cell, he wasn't alone. Jesus was there. When the guards changed shifts, Jesus remained. When night fell and darkness filled the cell, Jesus was still present. The nearness of the Lord wasn't a nice idea. It was Paul's daily reality. For the Philippians facing persecution, this truth was like oxygen. Paul was telling them how to experience more of it. Put into practice what you've learned. Don't just be hearers, be doers. Faith without action is dead. It's not real faith if it doesn't change how you live. Theology that stays in your head and never reaches your hands and feet, worthless. Paul had spent the whole letter teaching them truth. Now, he was making sure they understood that truth demands application. Paul's teaching in these verses revealed a progression that's easy to miss, but incredibly important. He was describing how transformation actually happens. It starts in the mind and moves outward to actions, then to habits, and finally to character. First, you control your thoughts. You use the 8 filters Paul gave. You deliberately think about what's true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, and praiseworthy. This isn't easy at first. Your mind wants to go where it's always gone. You have to redirect it over and over. But something happens when you persist. The thoughts you think shape the actions you take. If you fill your mind with noble thoughts, you start making noble choices. If you dwell on what's pure, you avoid impure actions. If you think about what's excellent, you pursue excellence in your daily life. Your thoughts guide your decisions. Do those actions repeatedly and they become habits. Habits are actions you do without thinking about them. They're automatic. When generosity becomes a habit, you give without internal debate. When kindness becomes a habit, you respond gently without having to force it. When prayer becomes a habit, you turn to God naturally when problems arise. Live with those habits long enough, and they form your character. Character is who you are at the deepest level. It's what comes out when you're under pressure, when no one's watching, when you don't have time to think. Your character is the sum of your habits, and your habits are the sum of your actions. And your actions flow from your thoughts. Paul understood this progression. That's why he spent so much time on the thought life. He knew that if he could get them to change what they thought about, everything else would follow. Change the mind, change the life. Modern science has discovered something called neuroplasticity. It means your brain can be rewired. The pathways in your brain get stronger the more you use them. Think the same thoughts over and over, and those neural pathways become like highways. The thoughts come easier and more automatically, but you can also build new pathways. When you deliberately think different thoughts, you're literally creating new connections in Toad, your brain. It feels hard at first because those pathways are new, but keep doing it and those new pathways get stronger. Eventually, the new way of thinking becomes natural. Paul didn't know about neurons and synapses, but he understood the principle. You become what you repeatedly think about. Your thought patterns shape your brain, which shapes your behavior, which shapes your life. This is why the battle for the mind is so crucial. Win there, and everything else follows. Who's there, and even the best intentions fall apart. Paul's teaching on controlling thought life was radical in his culture, and it's equally radical today. The Philippians lived in a Roman world that celebrated violence, sexual immorality, and power. Entertainment involved watching people kill each other in arenas. Temples to false gods promoted prostitution as worship. The culture constantly pushed thoughts that failed every one of Paul's 8 filters. Paul was calling them to be completely different. Don't just resist the culture a little bit. Resist it fundamentally by controlling what you allow into your mind. Don't consume what everyone else consumes. Don't think what everyone else thinks. Apply the filter. Be radically selective about what you give your mental attention to. This wasn't about being ignorant. Paul knew what was happening in the world around him. He understood the culture, but he didn't let it shape his thinking. He chose carefully what deserved his mental energy and what didn't. The same challenge exists today, maybe even more intensely. Modern culture floods people's minds with content constantly. News designed to make you angry. Entertainment filled with violence and immorality. Social media that promotes comparison and envy. Advertising that creates dissatisfaction. The stream never stops. Paul's 8 filters offer a way to navigate this flood. Before you read that article, watch that show, scroll through that feed, or engage in that conversation, run it through the filters. Is it true? Is it noble? Is it right? Is it pure? Is it lovely? Is it admirable? Is it excellent? Is it praiseworthy? Most of what fills modern media would fail these tests completely. It's not that everything is evil, it's that very little of it is worth filling your mind with. Paul was teaching the Philippians and us to be extremely selective. Your mind is valuable. Don't let just anything in. This requires intentional effort. The default is to consume whatever comes your way. Everyone else is watching this show, so you watch it. Everyone's talking about this controversy, so you dive into it. Everyone's outraged about this issue, so you get outraged too. Paul was saying, stop following the crowd. Think about different things. This makes you countercultural. You'll miss references others get. You won't know about the latest scandal everyone's discussing. You might seem out of touch, but you'll also have peace that others don't have. Your mind will be clearer. Your spirit will be calmer. You'll be thinking about excellent and praiseworthy things while others are drowning in negativity. Paul's teaching here wasn't about withdrawing from the world. Christians are called to engage with culture, to be lights in darkness. But you can't be a light if you filled your lamp with the same darkness everyone else has. You engage from a different mental foundation. You bring truth, nobility, purity, and excellence into a culture desperately needing those things. The choice is yours. Every day, hundreds times a day, you decide what to think about. Paul gave you the tools to make those decisions wisely. Paul shifted to address something personal. The Philippians had sent him a gift, and he needed to acknowledge it properly. In verse 10, he wrote, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. Notice how Paul framed his gratitude. He rejoiced greatly in the Lord, not just, I'm happy you sent money. He connected their gift to his relationship with God. Their generosity was something that made him rejoice in the Lord, not just in the gift itself. The phrase at last might sound like a complaint, but Paul immediately clarified what he meant. They'd been concerned for him all along. They wanted to help, but they hadn't had the opportunity. Maybe they didn't know where he was. Maybe they didn't have the resources until now. Maybe the distance made it impossible to get help to him. Paul wasn't criticizing them for taking so long. He was recognizing that they had finally found a way to do what they'd wanted to do. The Philippians had sent their gift through a man named Epaphroditus. This wasn't mentioned in verse 10, but it was part of the largest story of this letter. Epaphroditus had traveled from Philippi to Rome, a dangerous journey of over 800 meters. He had carried money from the church to support Paul in prison. The journey had nearly killed Epaphroditus. He had gotten seriously sick along the way. But he pushed through because he was carrying something precious, the love and support of the Philippian church for their spiritual father. That's the kind of sacrifice this gift represented. It wasn't just coins in a bag. It was a life-risking demonstration of love. Paul was genuinely grateful. You could hear it in his words. These people cared about him. They remembered him. They went to great lengths to help him. That meant something deep to Paul. He had poured his life into starting this church, and now they were pouring back into him. But Paul was careful about how he expressed his thanks. He didn't grovel. He didn't make them feel like he was dependent on their charity. He didn't manipulate them for more. He acknowledged their gift with genuine joy, but he maintained his dignity and independence. This balance was important for what he was about to teach them. Immediately after thanking them, Paul made a statement that seemed almost to contradict his gratitude. In verse 11, he wrote, "I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances." This was crucial. Paul didn't want them to think his joy came from their gift. Yes, he was grateful. Yes, he appreciated their sacrifice. But his internal state wasn't dependent on whether they sent money or not. He had something deeper than financial security. He had contentment. The word learned was key. Paul said, "I have learned to be content." This wasn't natural to him. He wasn't born with some special ability to be content. He had to learn it. It came through experience, through practice, through repeated choices to trust God, regardless of circumstances. Contentment is one of those things everyone wants, but few people find. Most people spend their whole lives chasing it. They think the next job will bring contentment, the next relationship, the next purchase, the next achievement. They're always reaching for something they don't have, believing that when they get it, they'll finally be satisfied. But Paul had discovered something different. He had learned to be content, whatever the circumstances, not in good circumstances only, not when things were going his way. Whatever the circumstances, good or bad, easy or hard, abundant or scarce, he had found contentment that didn't depend on external conditions. This was the opposite of everything his culture taught. Rome promised contentment through conquest and wealth. Greek philosophy promised it through detachment from desire. Mystery religions promised it through secret knowledge and rituals. But Paul's contentment came from none of these sources. He had learned it. That meant there was a process. There were lessons involved. Times when he had to choose contentment, when his feelings wanted to choose bitterness or despair. Moments when he had to remind himself of truth, when circumstances were screaming lies. Days when he had to practice gratitude, when complaining would have been easier. The phrase, whatever the phrase, whatever the phrase, whatever the phrase, circumstances covered everything. Literally everything. There was no situation Paul could face where this contentment didn't apply. Prison, contentment was possible. Freedom, contentment was there too. Hunger, yes. Plenty, also, yes. Sickness, health. Success, failure, friendship, loneliness. Contentment was available in all of it. This wasn't fake positivity. Paul wasn't pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. He knew his circumstances were difficult. He was honest about his struggles, but his internal stability didn't rise and fall with his external conditions. He had found something that held steady no matter what. Paul gave specifics to prove he wasn't theorizing. In verse 12, he continued, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty." He knew both extremes. This wasn't someone who had always been comfortable telling poor people to be content with their poverty. Paul had actually experienced both ends of the spectrum. He knew what need felt like. Real need, not inconvenience, but genuine lack. Before becoming a follower of Jesus, Paul had been Saul of Tarsus. He came from a good family. He was educated under the best teachers. He was a Pharisee, which meant he had status and respect. He had known what it was like to have plenty. Money wasn't a problem. Food was available. Clothing was adequate. Respect came easily. Then everything changed. When Saul met Jesus, on the road to Damascus, his old life ended. He became Paul the missionary. And missionaries in the first century didn't have guaranteed salaries and retirement plans. Paul often had nothing. He worked with his hands, making tents to support himself. He went hungry. He slept outside. He wore the 40 no come, same worn clothes for months. He knew need, deep need. The kind where you don't know where your next meal is coming from. The kind where you're cold at night because you don't have a warm place to sleep. The kind where you look around and realize you own almost nothing. But Paul also still experienced times of plenty. Sometimes churches supported him well. Sometimes his tent-making business did well. Sometimes believers hosted him in comfortable homes with good food and warm beds. He wasn't always in need. He moved back, forth between having plenty and having nothing. Both situations tested him. When he had nothing, the test was obvious. Would he trust God to provide? Would he stay faithful when following Jesus meant losing everything comfortable? When he had plenty, the test was different. Would he stay dependent on God? Would he remember that the plenty came from God and could disappear tomorrow? Paul passed both tests. He learned contentment in need by trusting God's provision and caring. He learned contentment in plenty by remembering that things don't satisfy and everything can be lost. The extremes taught him that contentment wasn't located in either place, it was somewhere else entirely. Paul described his discovery using interesting language. Still in verse 12, he wrote, "I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation." The word secret carried weight. In Paul's the world, mystery religions were popular. These religions claimed to have secret knowledge available only to those who went through special initiations. They promised that if you learned their secrets, you would find fulfillment and meaning. Paul used their language, but flipped its meaning. Yes, there was a secret to contentment, but it wasn't hidden in some exclusive club. It wasn't reserved for spiritual elites who performed the right rituals. It was available to anyone, but most people missed it because they were looking in the wrong place. The secret was simple, but profound. Contentment comes from union with Christ, not from circumstances. You can't find it by getting what you want. You can't achieve it by removing all problems. Sometimes his tent-making business did well. Sometimes believers hosted him in comfortable homes with good food and warm beds. He wasn't always in need. He moved back, forth between having plenty and having nothing. Both situations tested him. When he had nothing, the test was obvious. Would he trust God to provide? Would he stay faithful when following Jesus meant losing everything comfortable? When he had plenty, the test was different. As long as you believe happiness comes from having the right job, the right relationship, the right amount of money, or the right circumstances, you'll never find contentment. You'll keep chasing it forever. The secret required a fundamental shift in thinking. Instead of asking, what do I need to change about my circumstances to be content? You had to ask, how do I deepen my connection with Christ so that my circumstances don't control my contentment? The first question has no lasting answer. The second question leads to the secret. Paul had learned this secret in any and every situation. He emphasized this because he wanted them to understand how comprehensive it was. Not just some situations, not just the easy ones, any and every situation. The secret worked everywhere because it wasn't about the situations, it was about Christ. Paul continued being specific. In the second half of verse 12, he wrote, "Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want," he got down to the physical realities, well-fed or hungry. These weren't metaphors. Paul was talking about actual food, times when he had eaten well and his stomach was satisfied, times when he had gone without food and his stomach hurt from hunger. Hunger is a powerful thing. It's not just uncomfortable. It affects your thinking. It makes you irritable. It drains your energy. When you're truly hungry, not just I skipped lunch hungry, but I haven't eaten in days hungry, it dominates your awareness. Everything else fades. All you can think about is food. Paul had experienced that level of hunger. In his missionary journeys, there were times when food simply wasn't available, times when he had no money to buy it and no one to give it to him, times when he went to sleep with his stomach empty and woke up the same way. He knew what real hunger felt like. He also knew what being well-fed felt like. Times when there was plenty of good food available, times when he ate until he was fully satisfied, times when he didn't have to worry about where his next meal would come from because there was more than enough. The same contrast applied to general circumstances. living in plenty versus living in want. Plenty meant having enough of everything, enough money, enough clothes, enough shelter, enough security. Want meant lacking these things, not having enough, not knowing how needs would be met. Paul's point wasn't that circumstances don't matter. He wasn't saying hunger and plenty feel the same, or that you shouldn't care whether you have enough. Obviously, they're different. Obviously, one is more comfortable than the other. Hunger hurts. Poverty is hard. These are real problems that affect real people. But here's what Paul had learned. His internal state didn't have to match his external state. He could be hungry, but not hopeless. He could be in want, but not in despair. His joy, his peace, his contentment, these came from a source that didn't depend on whether his stomach was full or his wallet was full. This is what made his teaching so powerful. He wasn't some rich person telling poor people to be happy with their poverty. He was someone who had lived both realities and found that contentment was available in both. The source was constant even when the circumstances constantly changed. Then, Paul revealed where his strength came from. In verse 13, he wrote, what has become one of the most famous verses in the Bible. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. This verse gets quoted constantly, often in ways Paul never intended. People use it before sports games, business presentations, and personal challenges of all kinds. They treat it like a promise that they can accomplish anything they set their minds to if they just have enough faith. But that's not what Paul was saying. Look at what all this referred to. He wasn't talking about winning championships or closing business deals or achieving dreams. He was talking about being content, whether hungry or well-fed, whether in plenty or in want. The all this pointed back to the specific challenge of contentment in varying circumstances. Paul was saying, Christ gives him strength to be content when he's hungry. Christ gives him strength to remain steady when he has nothing. Christ gives him strength to stay faithful when circumstances are crushing. That's what the verse means. It's about enduring hardship with contentment, not about achieving worldly success. The strength didn't come from Paul. He made that clear through him who gives me strength, not through his own willpower, not through positive thinking, not through trying harder. Through Christ, Jesus was the source of the strength that allowed Paul to face any circumstance with contentment. This strength was real and practical. When Paul's stomach was empty and he wanted to despair, Christ gave him strength, trust instead. When Paul was beaten and imprisoned and he wanted to give up, Christ gave him strength to continue. When Paul faced the possibility of execution and he could have been terrified, Christ gave him strength, face it with peace. Without this strength from Christ, Paul couldn't do it. He was honest about that. He wasn't claiming to be superhuman. He was claiming to be connected to a supernatural source of power. That connection made the difference between collapsing under circumstances and standing firm through them. People who try to apply this verse to everything in life miss the beauty of what Paul was actually saying. He wasn't promising that Christians can do literally anything. He was promising something more specific and more valuable. Christians can endure anything with contentment because Christ provides the strength to do so. After explaining his contentment, Paul circled back to acknowledge the Philippians' gift more fully. In verse 14, he wrote, "Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles." Paul wanted them to know their gift mattered, even though he had just spent several verses explaining that he didn't need their money for contentment. He didn't want them to think their generosity was meaningless. It wasn't. It was good of them to give. But notice how he described their giving. They didn't just send money, they shared in his troubles. Their gift represented more than a financial transaction. It was partnership. When they gave to support Paul, they were joining him in his mission. They were participating in his work. Paul was in prison for preaching the gospel. His troubles were directly connected to spreading the message of Jesus. The Philippians couldn't travel to Rome and preach alongside him. They couldn't appear in court with him or share his cell. But by supporting him financially, they enabled him to continue his ministry. Their money said, "We're with you. We're part of this. Your work is our work." This partnership principle runs throughout Scripture. When God's people support those who are doing ministry work, they're not just helping an individual, They're investing in the kingdom of God. The results of that ministry belong to everyone who made it possible. Think of it this way. When the Philippians sent money to Paul, and Paul used that support to write letters that have changed millions of lives for 2,000 years, who gets credit? Just Paul? No. The Philippians, who made it possible, share in the reward. They partnered with him in the work. This transformed how they should think about giving. It wasn't charity in the sense of feeling sorry for poor Paul. It was investment in the sense of funding kingdom work. Every person who came to faith through Paul's ministry, every church that was strengthened by his teaching, every life that was changed by his example. The Philippians had a share in all of it because they made it possible. Paul was honoring their generosity by showing them what it really meant. You didn't just help me survive, you shared in my troubles. You became partners in what God is doing through me. Paul took this idea even further. In verse 17, he wrote, "Not that I desire your gifts. What I desire is that more be credited to your account." This revealed Paul's heart. His motivation in acknowledging their gift wasn't to encourage them to send more money for his benefit. He genuinely wasn't focused on getting more support. What he cared about was their spiritual prosperity. He wanted more credited to their account. God keeps accounts. This was Paul's teaching. He was claiming to be connected to a supernatural source of power. That connection made the difference between collapsing under circumstances and standing firm through them. People who try to apply this verse to everything in life miss the beauty of what Paul was actually saying. He wasn't promising that Christians can do literally anything. He was promising something more specific and more valuable. In heaven's economy, interest compounds eternally. The gift they sent supported Paul, who wrote letters, which built churches, which raised up believers, who spread the gospel further, which saved more souls, which built more churches, and on and on. The ripple effects of their generosity would echo through eternity. All of that was being credited to their account. Paul's desire for them wasn't that they would make him comfortable, it was that they would invest wisely in eternity. Generosity toward kingdom work is the best investment anyone can make. The returns don't show up in quarterly statements, but they accumulate forever. This completed Paul's teaching on contentment. He had shown them that contentment comes from Christ, not circumstances. He could be content, whether hungry or well-fed. He could do all this through Christ, who gave him strength. But contentment didn't make him selfish. It freed him to care about others' spiritual prosperity. Generosity toward kingdom work is the best investment anyone can make. The returns don't show up in quarterly statements, but they accumulate forever. This completed Paul's teaching on contentment. He had shown them that contentment comes from Christ, not circumstances. He could be content, whether hungry or well-fed. He could do all this through Christ, who gave him strength. But contentment didn't make him selfish. It freed him to care about others' spiritual prosperity. Remember, the same God who strengthened Paul in prison is with you right now. His peace is available, his joy is real, and his strength is enough for whatever you're facing today.